Man, it's good to see everybody. It's always fun to see such a packed house. Of course, it's kind of strange. Everybody's sitting here doing this. Ooh, cool it down. Cool it down. Hey, I just want those of you that are in the back that are standing to know there are seats right up front here. I mean, right in the spittle area. It's right here. So if you want to, nobody's coming here. I just want to let you know that there are some free seats. All right, so here we are. We're at the last of this series that we've entitled Worry. And it has been a challenging series. I don't know if it's been challenging to you. Of course, I know that for some of you, it's been extremely challenging because I've heard some of your text messages, and some of you have even taken me aside and said, hey, you know what? I've been really struggling this week, or I've been going through a difficult time here. And then a lot of people, last week I defined the difference between worry and concern. And unfortunately, Webster says that concern is worry, and so it's kind of the same thing. But we like to think it's two different things. But I went ahead last week, and if you didn't get that, I encourage you to get the CD. I went ahead and gave you at least a little bit of a reprieve there, so that some of us could walk away and say, okay, I'm not worried, I'm just concerned. I'm just concerned about things. But what we've been doing is we're taking a look at what Jesus has to say about worry. And we looked in Matthew chapter 6. And in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus looks at the crowd and essentially looks at us. And he says to us, he says, do not worry about your life. Don't worry about the big things. Don't worry about the small things. Just don't worry. Which I don't know about you, but that seems relatively insensitive. Because I look at him and I think to myself, well, now wait a second, Jesus, what do you mean don't worry? How do you just stop worrying? You can't just stop worrying. I mean, it's a part of who I am. It's a part of my makeup. But I've been raised a worrier. That's just who I am. Matter of fact, I need to go to a 12-step program just for worry alone. Just so we can all sit in the corner or sit in a circle there, and I can stand up and say, hi, I'm Lance, and I'm a worrier, right? I mean, there's a lot of you that are kind of like that. And Jesus looks at us and says, but it is possible for you to curb your worrying. It's possible for you to get to a place to where you worry less than you worry today. And the way that he tells us we can do this, and if you didn't get this, man, I encourage you to get those CDs. What he told us is that you need to take the things that you're focusing on, the things that really have you worried, and begin to stop focusing so much on them and begin to focus on the one that can actually take care of the problem. To look over at those situations. Because here's what Jesus knows. See, Jesus knows things that we don't always get, we don't always understand. Jesus understands that worry is kind of like a snowball rolling down a hill. That the more that you do it, the larger it gets. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that. You know, you begin to worry a little bit, right? You've got a little something, like a seed of worry, and you start to lean into that a little bit. And then before you know it, it gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. And then you start thinking about all the different things that could go wrong and all the things that have gone wrong. And it just kind of compiles to a place to where it becomes so unmanageable. You cannot control it any longer. And Jesus says, I understand that worry can get so out of hand. You know, several years ago, I had the opportunity, back whenever I was preparing a message similar to this, and we were going through the whole worry thing, which the interesting thing about worry is that we can talk about this next week as well, and just keep talking about it next year and then next month, and still, you're still going to struggle with worry. That's the sad thing about this. But I was talking with a gentleman, his name is Bill Wilson. Many of you know who Bill Wilson is. In 1980s, he was diagnosed with cancer. And he fought cancer for about 5 to 6 years, and he ended up beating cancer, which is phenomenal, right? To beat cancer, that's just incredible. And then in 1998, he was diagnosed with a rare form of blood disease or blood cancer. And he has been fighting this blood disease, this blood cancer, since 1998. So that's 17 years. 17 years of going into the doctor, having not only chemo and sometimes even some radiation, and then at times these blood transfusions where they're fusing white blood cells and red blood cells, and they're just completely emptying him out and then putting new stuff in there. And one day he and I were talking, and I was asking him about worry. And he says, Lance, I can't worry. And I said, what do you mean you can't worry? He says, worry is a negative emotion. And you don't understand. My body and what's going on inside of me and the immune system and everything that I'm struggling with, I can't focus on the things that might happen. That will kill me. I have to focus on the positive things. And what he ultimately ended up saying to me is, he says, listen, worry is like white noise. It just limits God. It's white noise, and it makes it to the point to where I can't hear the voice of God. So instead of hearing God say it's going to be okay, instead of hearing God say just rest in me, instead of hearing God say I'm big enough for this situation, whenever we worry, it just drowns out that entire situation. He went so far as to tell me, Lance, I have to eliminate worriers from my life. At which point I thought, well, then I probably should get up and leave because I'm one of those worriers. But it is so fine-tuned, and Jesus understands that, and he desires for us to not go down that road. Because whenever we worry, then we act as though there is no God. We act as though there is no way that God can take care of the situation. And here's the thing that you need to understand, and this is just a simple thing. Worry ends up taking you places that you wouldn't normally go on your own. Isn't that true? Come on. Don't you mentally, whenever you start worrying about something, it kind of takes you down a road that you would have never ever saw yourself going. It even takes you down a road, not just mentally, but physically. You find yourself in places that you would never be. You find yourself doing things and saying things that you would never ever say. Whenever I was about 5 or 6 years old, and my dad decided that it was time for me to learn to ride a bike. And it was one of those weird things because I don't know, it was just strange. I wasn't a kid that kind of said, hey, Dad, I need to learn to ride a bike. Everybody else is riding a bike. My dad kind of looked around the neighborhood. He says, hey, all the kids that are your age are riding a bike. He says, I think it's time for you to learn to ride a bike. So the only bike we had was a 3-speed. Now, I don't know how many of you are old enough to know what a 3-speed is. It's like a mountain bike, so it's a big monster thing, but it only had 3 speeds. So he takes me out there and he sets me, 5 years old, sets me on the seat because I couldn't get on the seat myself, sets me on the seat, feet can barely touch the pedals. He takes me out to the middle of the road and he starts to walk me down, and I'm kind of pedaling and I'm going faster and faster, and he starts to run alongside and he's got the back of the seat and everything's fine, so if I start to go off a little bit, he pulls me back and he's running along, and then all of a sudden he lets go. And the minute that he lets go, I knew, I could feel it. I could feel that he was no longer there. I could no longer hear his steps. I could no longer feel his presence and his controlling. And I was sitting there and I was trying to control this big bike. And off to the left over here, I saw that there was a huge tree. And in my mind, I kept telling myself, don't hit the tree, don't hit the tree, don't hit the tree, don't hit the tree. And you know what happened? I began to go to the tree. And not only did I start going towards the tree, I kept telling myself, stop going towards the tree, stop going towards the tree. You're going to hit the tree, you're going to hit the tree, and I hit the tree. And that's what worry does to you. Worry ends up making things that would never, ever really happen because you're so focused on them instead of being focused on the God who can take care of the situations. Now today we're going to go into the Old Testament. We're going to take, this is going to be really cool because this is like an illustration. This is a real life illustration that everybody in the room, you may not experience what he experienced, but you're going to be able to fit yourself into this situation. We're going to take a look in 1 Kings chapter 19. And it's an interesting thing because this is the story of Elijah. Not the whole story of Elijah, but one little slice of his life. And in this situation, we're going to find that Elijah, he goes through this tremendous victory, right? Just this incredible victory. And he's on cloud 9. He sees God work. He watches God work. It's just an incredible thing. And then he meets a vicious foe. And when he meets the vicious foe, then he begins to worry. And that worry ends up taking him someplace that he ought not to be. And then God shows up and God asks him a question. He asks him a question that everybody should ask whenever you find yourself worrying and you find yourself someplace that you ought not to be. So that's where we're going to go today. Before we get there, let me give you just a little bit of background. I'm not going to read all the scriptures. We've got a lot of scriptures to read anyway, but I'm going to go back from 1 Kings 19, and we're going to jump back to 1 Kings chapter 18. And just as a little bit of background in the situation that happened here, okay, let's go back even further than I want to. Israel, they were in Egypt. They were being held captive in Egypt. And you know the story that God meets with Moses and he says, Moses, I want you to go and I want you to tell Pharaoh to let my people go and all that stuff. So Moses does all that stuff. Finally, Pharaoh lets him go. There's more struggle than what I'm telling you. And they go and then they show up in the promised land after wandering about and everything else. They show up in the promised land. And while they're in the promised land, God is their king. God's the one that's in control. And all they have to do is just trust God. God sends prophets. God sends judges. God keeps telling them what it is that they need to do. And they just need to trust God. But at one point, they make a decision. They start looking around at all the other countries and they say, you know what? All these other countries have kings. We don't have a king. We want a king. So they tell the prophet of that time, they say, hey, you go and tell God that we want a king. So God says, okay, if you want a king, we'll give you a king. So they have their first king, and their first king, his name was Saul. right? King Saul. And after King Saul, they had their most famous king of all. Anybody remember his name after Saul? David. Very good. You guys are good up front here. Right? You guys get A's and stars and everything else. And then after David, then we had David's son, and his name was, wisest man, Solomon. Very good, very good. So Solomon reigned, and he kind of made some decisions that weren't real strong. And then after, well, actually, they were pretty strong, but they just were too strong. And after he left, then the kingdom, they had another king, and the kingdom divided. And they had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was Israel. The southern kingdom was Judah. And they had several kings. I mean, it was just a constant, battle between things and trying to get things to work and never really getting along and just all kinds of things. And then all of a sudden we come to 860 BC. So those of you that are kind of keeping track here, that's 2,860 years ago. Okay, so 860 BC is where we're at. And Israel at this time had a king, and his name was Ahab. Now, Ahab was not a good king. As a matter of fact, the scripture says that he was a wicked king. And the reason that they call him a wicked king is because not only did he himself worship other gods, but he got rid of the altars to God and said, I want all of you to worship false gods. Now, he didn't say false gods, but I want you to worship these other gods. I want you to follow these other gods. And what usually happens, or God does something for Ahab that he does for all of us at one point or another. Whenever you start to get off the road you're supposed to be on, right? You start to go a different direction than what you're supposed to. God usually sends somebody your way, right? Isn't that true? Somebody ends up showing up in your life. You don't really see them as being like a prophet from God, because a lot of times it's like your mom. It's like, okay, you're not a prophet, you're my mom, okay? Or maybe it's your dad, or maybe it's your best friend, or maybe it's just a total stranger off the street, but somebody comes to you and they begin to talk to you about the situation that you're going through, whatever it is, and they kind of go, I've noticed that you're not doing a lot of the things that you used to do. Right? And Ahab does, well, he does what all of us do, right? Whenever somebody comes to us and they say, you're really not doing the right thing. He says, thank you so much for telling me. I really appreciate you telling me that. I'm going to change. Isn't that what you guys do? You don't do it that way? No, not at all. You say, get out of my business. You have no right to tell me anything. You don't even know my life. You don't know what I'm really going through. You don't know the situations that I'm doing. You don't know why I'm making the decisions I'm making. You have no idea. Just leave me alone. So God sends Elijah to talk to Ahab. And Elijah goes and says, listen, you are leading the people astray. You yourself, as the king of Israel, you're leading astray. You're doing the wrong things. You need to change. And at that point, Ahab looks at him and says, no, I'm not going to do that. So Elijah looks at King Ahab and says, okay, you know what? The Lord has told me that since you won't change, there will be no rain in Israel. Now, for those of us that live in the Northwest, that's kind of hard to believe that there would ever be no rain anyway. But in that part of the country, much like this part of the country, rain is essential. If you don't have any rain, you don't have any crops, you don't have any livestock, you can't keep things alive, and that's the economy, and the economy is going to go flat. And Elijah just looks at Ahab and says, listen, if you don't do something right, if you don't make some decisions and start to turn things around, then God's going to take the rain away. It's going to crush the economy. And Ahab looks at Elijah and says, you go do whatever you're big enough to do. If you think your God's all that, then you go ahead. Let's see what God can do. So Elijah says, okay, and he goes away. Months go by, no rain. Weeks go by, months go by. Finally, God comes to Elijah and says, Elijah, you know what? It's about to get a little bit crazy here. Why don't you kind of go off into the country, and I'll take care of you. I just want you to kind of hide. Not because I can't protect you, because I'm going to take care of you, but because you're the one who said that I was going to turn the rain off. They're going to think that you could actually turn the rain back on. So they're going to come to you and they're going to try to twist you into turning the rain back on. So Elijah, I want you to go and hide. And while he's hiding, God takes tremendous care of him. As a matter of fact, the entire country of Israel starts to fall apart. But Elijah has everything that he needs. After 3 years of no rain, God comes back to Elijah and he says, Elijah, it's time for you to go to Ahab again. And Ahab looks up to God, or there wasn't a physical being there, but he kind of talks to God and says, God, I really don't think that's a good idea. Maybe after 3 days, if I showed back up, then maybe Ahab would listen to me. But 3 years, I hear he's kind of mad. I hear he's got a bounty out on my head. And God says, that's okay. I want you to go. So Elijah decides to go. And he shows up to Ahab, and Ahab's not real happy about the situation, but he understands that Elijah is the only one that can change the situation. So he looks at Elijah, and he says, Elijah, what do you have for me now? And Elijah shows up, and he says, well, there's been no rain. I've noticed that. He says, here's what we're going to do. You seem to think that your God is big. You seem to think that your God is the God that's in charge. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to call all of the prophets of Baal. Baal is their God. And I want you to have them meet me up on Mount Carmel. We're going to have the contest to end all contests, all right? This is going to be the big deal. I want everybody to show up there, and we're going to have just the showdown of gods. So Ahab gathers all of his prophets, and there's 400 prophets that show up on Mount Carmel. And Elijah's there, and he's all by himself. And not only are there 400 prophets, but, is what happened in any situation, whenever there's a fight. I don't know if you remember that, like when you were in high school and everyone's like, fight. And there's two people that are mad at each other, but by the time you get out to where the fight is, there's like hundreds gathered around. So there are thousands gathered around because they hear there's going to be a fight, a showdown between the gods. And they want to see this. They want to see what's going to happen. So Elijah shows up and he looks over at them and he says, okay, I tell you what, this is what I want you to do. I want you to build an altar. And then whenever you build the altar, you're going to ask your God, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to repair the old altar, the altar that you used to use to worship God. And then we're going to have a showdown, and you're going to pray to your God. And we're going to ask your God to send fire down from heaven and to consume all that's on the altar and to consume the altar. So you do that. You guys pray and you ask and you build your altar and do all the things that you need to do. I'm going to be over here taking care of this situation. So that's what they do. They begin to build their altar and they begin to pray, and they start praying and they start shouting and they start dancing and they start cutting themselves. They start doing all kinds of crazy things just to get their God's attention somehow, some way. And this happens all the way from morning until noon. And at this point, Elijah's kind of sitting back and he's watching what's happening. And he starts to laugh. And then he starts to poke fun at them. As a matter of fact, he starts to say some politically incorrect things. Listen to what Elijah says. This is 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 27. I can just imagine, here they are. They're all shouting and dancing, and they're cutting themselves. They're trying everything that they can in order to gather God and their God. And Elijah is kind of sitting back, and he yells out, and he says, shout louder. Surely he is God. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy. Which, by the way, that word busy, that means maybe he's off to the bathroom. Maybe he's in the restroom. So he's busy. Or maybe he's traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. See, he starts poking at him. He starts saying, listen, you need to do something. And this continues all the way into the evening. And Baal hasn't done anything. So Elijah looks at them and says, okay, it's my turn. And he goes over to the altar that he had prepared, and he puts the animal's carcass up on it, and he says, listen, before I call my God, I want to make things really, really difficult. So what I want you to do is I want you to pour these huge drums of water over the top of the altar. I want you to just drench this. So they're all thinking to themselves, okay, well, that sounds good. We can do that. And plus, it would make it really hard for your God, because obviously our God didn't come through. It'd make it really hard for your God to consume your thing. So they do it. They come and they pour it on top. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. To the point to where the trench that was dug around there is completely full of this water, which is somewhat interesting when you think about it, because you got to remember there has been no rain up to this point. So in order to do this, they had to take the reserves, everything that they had, in order to show that God was not God. Which is kind of weird, because whenever you get to a place where you're running from God, you will do everything you can to show that God's not really God. And then at that point, Elijah goes ahead and he prays. And God sends fire. And it consumes everything, laps up all the water, all of the altar, everything that's there. And the people that had gathered, the ones that are going, fight, 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 They start shouting, Baal is not God, Baal is not God, Elijah's God is God, Elijah's God is God. And then they go and they kill all the prophets for misleading them. So it becomes just this incredible bloodbath, a terrible, terrible situation. And Elijah looks over at King Ahab and he says, King, you need to go back home because the rain's coming. So Ahab starts to head back to Jerusalem, back to his palace. And while he's taking off, Elijah goes up on the hillside and he sits down and he looks over at his servant. He says, hey, listen, would you run up on top there, up on top of that rock, and would you just check and see if there's any clouds? And the servant runs out there and looks, and there's no clouds. And he comes back and he tells Elijah there's no clouds. So Elijah begins to pray again. He says, would you go and check? And he runs and he checks and he comes back and he says, there's no clouds whatsoever. Which at this point, you're starting to think, wait a second, God, you asked me to do this, and you're not working the way you're supposed to be working. This happened 7 times. Isn't it interesting? Because a lot of times whenever we want something, we pray once, and when God doesn't do it, we just get mad. We just get angry, and we walk away, and we get upset with God. We disappointed with God, and we walk away. And I think something happens in the persistence of the prayer. In the fact of saying, God, I know that you've said that you would give this to me. I'm going to persist in this situation. So Elijah continues to persist until finally, whenever the servant comes back and says, wait a second, there's a small cloud that is forming. And then it began to rain. Well, meanwhile, in the midst of this deluge, this water that's just pouring everywhere, Ahab went back home. And he sat down with his wife. And he began to complain to his wife. Any of you husbands ever had a bad day at work and you go back to home and you look over at your wife and you start telling her about all the stuff that's going on at work and how the boss is mean and this and this and this and this? So he begins to tell her everything that happened. And listen to this. This is 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 1. It says, now Ahab, oh, by the way, anybody know the name of Ahab's wife? Jezebel. It's on the screen so you could actually look. I should have asked earlier, because then that would have been a really good question. You would have had to come up with something. So anyway, let's just read this. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, how he had killed all the prophets with the sword, which by this point, she's pretty angry. She's pretty angry because these are all of her prophets. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. Not like one of the gods, but like one of the prophets. In other words, Elijah, I'm coming for you. You better watch your back. You better sleep with one eye open. That's what she's saying. Now, just for a moment, come on, stick with me. You were just a part of God's activity, right? I mean, you were smack dab in the middle of God's will. Not only did you show up and say, it's not going to rain, and it doesn't rain for 3 years. And then not only that, but you show up and you defeat all of the prophets of Baal. And then you pray, and God answers the prayer, and he consumes everything. And then on top of that, it begins to rain. God is on your side. He's there. You would think that whenever the messenger shows up to Elijah and says, listen, Jezebel's coming after you, Elijah would have looked at her, at the messenger, and said, bring it. My God's a big God. I don't care. You don't even have a God. I mean, if your God's, he's maybe still sleeping. I don't know. But he didn't show up for the fight. So if it were me and I were sitting there, okay, probably not. But anyway, in my mind, that's the way I think, because all of us think, okay, if God just did something phenomenal and amazing, then you would stand up and say, I got all the confidence in the world in my God. Listen to what happens. Verse 3. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Way to go, Elijah. Stand up. Oh, wait, what? What? You're afraid? And being afraid, by the way, listen, being afraid is just worry on drugs. That's all it is. It's like worry is this thing that kind of, oh yeah, okay, it could get bad, and then afraid that moves you to a place where you're paralyzed or you run away. That's a place where that's like worry big time. So instead of saying, did you not remember that God was faithful yesterday? He was there. And today, now you're running? Today you're taking off? Today you're leaving? But isn't that our story? Come on, isn't that some of your story? Haven't you had some situations where God has been so faithful to you? I mean, you prayed and you prayed and you prayed, and he answered the prayer, and maybe it wasn't the way that you wanted it to be, or maybe it was exactly the way that you wanted it to be, and you're praising him. You show up at church, you give testimony, you're telling people, you're singing songs, you've got your hands raised, you can't believe that you have such an awesome God, and then tomorrow you face something so big, and you begin to worry again, and you get afraid, and you begin to run. Isn't that our story? That's the way we are. That's exactly what happened. So listen to this. Elijah runs. It says, when he came to Beersheba in Judah, which, by the way, he left the country. This is 100 miles away. 100 miles away. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. In other words, he took off. He went 100 miles, and then he said, now you stay here. While he himself went a day's journey into the desert, and he came to a broom tree and sat down under it and prayed that he might die. Die? Really? But Elijah, your God is God. Elijah, he's been answering your prayer. Why would you do this? Why, Elijah? Listen to what he says. I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. In other words, they're dead and I want to be dead. Then he laid down under the bush and he fell asleep. Which to me, in this point, I think his fear made way to depression, which is kind of the natural state of things. I don't know if you've ever followed this and taken a look at like stages. It starts with a little concern, then it turns into worry, then it turns into fear, and then if you allow it to, it gets to the point of being depression. And depression gets you to a place where you just kind of check out, right? If you've ever struggled with depression at all, then you just want to sleep. You just want to go find some place and curl up and just forget the world. That's basically where Elijah's at. So he's gone through this incredible stage all within a week or 2 weeks or something like that. And yet God was still God. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up, eat." He looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and he drank, and then he laid down again. Then the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and he ate and he drank. And strengthened by the food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God, which, by the way, is somewhat significant. This is Mount Sinai that we're talking about. This is where the law was given to the people of God. And there's nowhere in here that does it say that the angel tells him, "I want you to go there." Nowhere does it say God says, "I want you to go there and meet me there," because truthfully, God has already met him. Wherever it is that he was at, he was willing to meet him at that spot. But I think at this point, Elijah is thinking to himself, I need to go where God will show up. So he runs to Mount Sinai. He runs to Mount Horeb. Verse 9. Then he went into a cave and he spent the night. And listen to this. This is so cool because at this point, God shows up and he asks the question that all of us should ask. Whenever you find yourself worrying and being consumed by that worry, listen to what he says. And the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? Isn't that a great question? That's a question that all of us should ask. Because the truth is that worry causes you to get to a place to where you begin to look at the situations as being bigger than they really are. And then you begin to find yourself running from God or running from the situation. You begin to detach yourself. Come on, isn't that true? Think about it. You detach yourself either mentally or emotionally from your family and from your friends. You're so overwhelmed with this worry. And you get to a place to where all you can do in the way that you respond to them is nothing but anger. Right? Every time that they say something to you, you just bite their head off. And then you get to a place where you begin to pull back. And you're afraid of actually having an intimate relationship with anybody because all you are is worried. And maybe if you haven't pulled back emotionally or mentally, then you have run physically. All of a sudden, you have found yourself running away from your family, running away from your parents, running away from your marriage, running away from your church, running away from your friends. Some of you are here today. And the weight of the world, the stress of things, has pushed you to a cave. And right now, you're in a place where you have totally disconnected you from the people and from the things that can actually make it possible for you to overcome. You don't think that, but you are. And that's where Elijah's at. He's in a cave, and God shows up. And he says, Elijah, what are you doing here? And then I love this, because Elijah tells God something that he thinks God doesn't know. You ever told God something that you think he doesn't know? You ever been in a prayer and you're sitting there going, God, I don't know if you know all the situation, so let me just give you the background on what's going on. So listen to this. This is cool. It says, he replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me. Why am I here? Where would you expect me to be, God? Jerusalem? No, they want to kill me there. I don't know if you know this or not, but Jezebel's crazy. She's nuts. I'm not going back there. There's no possible way. And then the Lord says something weird to him. The Lord said to him, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. To which at this point, if it were you or I, we would say, what good will that do? Right? Come on, how many times have you been going through a difficult situation and someone says, you know what, you really should read the Word of God, and you just want to punch them in the nose? How's your prayer life? Don't go there. Haven't seen you at church in a while. Yeah, there's a reason. Right? God shows up and says, listen, I want you to come. I want you to come visit me. I want you to come into my presence. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, and he went out and he stood at the mouth of the cave. Isn't that interesting? Because we think that God is because he's a mighty God, and he's the one that does huge, amazing things. But truthfully, it's not that he doesn't do those things. God is in the whisper. God is in the gentle nudge. God is in the place where the worry begins in your life. Because the truth is, if we could live on a mountaintop with God consuming all of our altars all the time, and every time we prayed, he did what it is that he was supposed to do, then we would never really truly hear him. We would just run around and ask him to do things. But it's in the moment when you begin to think things are not going to work out the way that I think they're going to work out, that God is there and he is talking to you and he is saying, no, I got this. But we refuse to listen because we're looking for him in the fire. We're looking for him in the wind. We want an earthquake. We want something big. And now that God's got Elijah's attention and Elijah has made his way out to the mouth of the cave, then the voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And I love this because Elijah once again says the same thing. He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites has rejected your covenant, broke down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me. Then the Lord said to him, go back the way you came. Go to the desert of Damascus, and when you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Japhat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as the prophet. Which at this point, Elijah has got to be thinking, whoa, wait. You have a plan? Yeah, I have a plan. I've been working this plan this whole time. You're the one that decided to abandon the plan. You're the one that decided to run away. You're the one that decided that the circumstances were too big. You're the one that focused on the things instead of me. You're the one, because of you, I've had to take a few more weeks in order to chase you down into this little cave and to find you and then to bring you back. Because Elijah, I want you to be a part of this, but you need to understand, I have something that I'm working. God, you mean you have a purpose behind all the things that you're doing? Yes. You mean the things that look like they're falling apart, they're not falling apart? I've got it. Oh. Listen to this. Listen to what God continues to go. He says, Jehu will put to death anyone who escapes the sword of Hazael. And Elisha will put to death anyone who escapes the sword of Jehu. Listen to this. Because remember, Elijah's problem was that I'm the only one that's here. I'm all alone. Listen to this. He says, yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him. Elijah, you think you're the only one, but you're not. I've got a plan. I'm working the plan. Take your eyes off of Jezebel. Take your eyes off of the big thing that you feel like is completely out of control and bring your eyes to me and watch what I'll do. See what I'll do. So what does this mean for us? See, all of us, whether you're there now or you'll be there tomorrow, and I hope you'll remember this, right? Because isn't it true? I mean, right now you're sitting there going, oh, that makes sense, okay, yeah. And then like a week from now, something's going to happen in your life, and you're going to run for the cave. A week from now, you're going to think that God's not big enough to take care of whatever the problem is. And somebody's going to come into your life, and they're going to say, no, he's big enough. Don't you remember what God did last week? And you say, no, but that was last week. God can't do it now. And you're going to run to the cave. You're going to remove you from the situation. You're going to remove yourself from the intimacy of other people and from God himself. And God's going to show up. And he's going to say, go back the way you came. I want you to go back to where you belong. I want you to go back and I want you to face the worry that you're worried about and watch what I'll do. I want you to go back and I want you to undo. I want you to do differently than what you've done before. I want you to go back and I want you to repair some situations, maybe repair some relationships, right? Because whenever we worry and we stress, then we end up saying things that we really probably don't really mean, but we do it because we're so stressed and we're so overwhelmed and we end up hurting other people. And he says, I want you to go back and I want you to trust me. I want you to mend those relationships and I want you to watch what I'm going to do. Go back. I love this. Jesus says, do not worry about your life. We say, but it's who I am. He says, no, it doesn't have to be who you are. Take your eyes off of the situation and place them on the one that can take care of it. And then in this situation, we see it lived out. And everybody in the room has been there, everybody. And maybe today you're hiding in the cave because you're so stressed. And you showed up today because you heard we were talking about worry and you said, you know what, I'm such a worrier. Oh my goodness, I need to do this. And what God is telling you is he is saying, I am big enough. Trust me. Go back. I'll take care of it. So what about you? What do you need to do? See, I think in an unusual way, God has brought you out to the mouth of the cave. And he hasn't shown up in the fire. He hasn't shown up in the earthquake. He hasn't shown up in the wind, which is what everybody wants. I just want to fix. Just fix it, God. But today he showed up in a whisper. And today the Spirit has talked to you. What are you going to do with that? Shake it off? That was weird, wasn't it? That was strange. Can't believe God would say anything. That can't be God. Are you going to go back and face what you're worried about and watch what he does? Because that's when he does the best work. When it seems like it is so overwhelming. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. God, I am sorry. I know there have been moments and there have been times in my life where, Lord, just like Elijah, I've allowed a little seed of doubt to get planted. And whatever the situation is, it's not as big as I think it is, but God, I believe that it's huge. And then, Lord, I allow it to become a worry. And then, Lord, that worry turns into fear, and then that fear gets to a place where it begins to be depression. And Lord, I just run and I hide from you. And I hide from the thing that I so desperately need. God, please forgive me. Please forgive us. I pray that right now, as each heart is here and each heart is crying out to you, and each heart wants to experience you so badly, and they know deep down inside, they know that you're big enough to take care of it. But Lord, they're scared. And if they were honest, they're afraid you won't do it the way that they want you to do it. But I pray that, God, today, we would just trust you. We would go back and we would work your plan. We would let you do something that is so amazing, something that only you could do. Oh, God, please. For Lord, I ask this in your precious name. Amen. Now listen. Today it's the end of this series. And what a tremendous series for us to come to the table with, right? And what a great time to really begin to reflect on what Jesus has done for us. He went to the cross for us. He took your sin. He made it possible for you to be forgiven so that you could have a relationship with the Heavenly Father that is beyond anything that you could ever imagine. And that's what we do. When we come to the table, that is exactly what we do. We remember the body that was given for us. We remember the blood that was spilled for us. This is so much more than coming and eating a little cracker and drinking a little juice. If that's what you do, don't come. But if you're coming to remember how great God is and how much he loves you and to how far he went so that you could have a relationship, come. And today, would you just set your worries, whatever those, I don't know what that's going to look like. Just leave them here and take Jesus instead. Would you do that? And then gather together with friends, family, and you guys pray and take the elements and remember how great your God is. You do that as we sing.
Before we get started here, the song I wanted to pick out when we found out we're wrapping up this awesome series. There's a lot of times I'm stressed out, worried about things, and I listen to that old hymn that keeps popping in my head, It Is Well. And I keep singing that over and over and over until I feel like a peace in my heart to get me through those times. And Vinny and I was talking before service about what does it as well mean, and that's old language for it's all good, right? It's all good in my soul. So we're going to sing that today as you come get it.
By
We're going to go ahead and dismiss at this time. You're more than welcome to stay and worship with us. We're going to do another song and continue to worship. You can go ahead and leave if you want. Thank you for worshiping with us today. It was amazing hearing everybody singing out. Enjoy your weekend. We're going to continue on. Over me, gracious tempest and sea, your love is like a storm.